September 28th, 2022. It is early afternoon on the southwest coast of Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico is climbing over Fort Myers Beach, not falling as rain, rising from underneath as a wall. Water is not supposed to move like this. In the low streets behind the shoreline, it comes in without a sound anyone can hear over the wind, filling driveways, then doorways, then living rooms, in the time it takes to decide whether to move. People who have lived on this coast their whole lives stand at their windows and watch the street turn into a channel, and then a river, and then a bay. Some of them are in their 80s. Some of them are alone. Almost none of them have anywhere left to go. For days, the forecast had pointed somewhere else. The cone of uncertainty had aimed at Tampa Bay, more than 100 miles to the north, and the people of Lee County had watched it and waited. By the time the order finally came to leave, the storm was nearly on top of them. For tens of thousands of people, the distance between the warning and the water had already closed. What happens here on this afternoon is one of the deadliest hurricanes in Florida in almost a century. And the thing that makes it deadly is not only the wind, and not only the sea. It is the gap between the moment the danger was known and the moment people were told to run. To understand how the Gulf came to fill these houses with the residents still inside them, you first have to understand where they were standing and how little time they were given. Southwest Florida is a low country. Lee County sits where the peninsula flattens towards the water, a maze of barrier islands, spits, and mangrove flats laid out only a few feet above sea level. Sanibel and Captiva curve out into the Gulf like a drawn bow. Fort Myers Beach runs along a narrow island called Estero, a single thin strip of sand crowded with cottages, mobile homes, and low motels. Pine Island stretches north into the Sound. These are the places people retire to. The population here skews older than almost anywhere in the country. Many of the residents are in their 70s and 80s, drawn by warm water and flat ground, living in single-story homes and manufactured houses that sit barely above the tide line. For most of the year, that is the whole appeal. The land is close to the sea, but everything that makes this coast beautiful is the same thing that makes it dangerous, because a place this low and this flat has almost no defense against water that decides to come inland. Fort Myers Beach, in particular, is a town of mobile homes and single-story cottages, many of them home to residents who cannot drive far, or fast, or alone. When the sea comes for a place like this, the question is never whether the buildings can take it. They cannot. The only question is whether the people are still inside. And this coast had gambled on a forecast before. In 2004, Hurricane Charlie was predicted to strike near Tampa Bay, and instead turned sharply in its final hours, and came ashore just up the shoreline at Charlotte Harbor as a Category 4. The people here remembered that. They remembered that the cone can move, and that it does not always move in your favor. By the fourth week of September 2022, a storm named Ian was moving through the Caribbean and into the Gulf of Mexico, and it was strengthening fast. Over water that was unusually warm, it crossed western Cuba and then exploded in size and power. At its peak over the Gulf, Ian became a Category 5 hurricane, with winds near 160 miles an hour and a central pressure that placed it among the most intense storms ever to approach the United States. The warnings were not vague. The National Hurricane Center forecast a storm surge of 12 to 18 feet along the coast in the Fort Myers area. That is not a number that damages a house. That is a number that puts a 2-story wall of seawater through a neighborhood built at sea level. The vulnerability was known. The surge was forecast, and the plan for what to do about it already existed, written down years in advance. Lee County's own emergency plan called for the most vulnerable people on the coast, the elderly, the disabled, the residents of the barrier islands, to be evacuated a full 48 hours before a storm like this arrived. County estimates warned that emptying the whole county could take up to 41 hours. In other words, the official plan understood something simple. On a coast this crowded and this old, you cannot start late, because leaving takes longer than the storm gives you. There is a name for the approach Lee County took. Emergency planners call it just-in-time evacuation, the idea that you wait until the forecast is nearly certain before you move people, so that you do not empty the coast for a storm that turns away at the last moment. It is a reasonable instinct. False alarms carry their own cost, and a county that cries wolf may find people ignoring the next order. But it is a gamble, and the stakes of that gamble are counted in hours, on a coast where the people most at risk are the ones who need the most time to leave. The neighbors made a different call. To the north, Sarasota County ordered evacuations on Monday, September 26th. Charlotte County, right next door, ordered its coastal zones out on the 26th as well. Up and down the forecast track, county after county told people to go. Lee County waited. Its mandatory evacuation order for the barrier islands did not take effect until 8 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday, September 27th. That was a little more than a day before landfall, and a full day after its neighbors. The order for the most exposed people on the coast came with far less than the 48 hours the county's own plan had asked for, and less time than the county's own estimates said a full evacuation would take. The reason given afterward was the forecast. The cone had pointed at Tampa Bay, and officials said they had followed the data as it slowly turned south. But the data had been turning for days, and the people who most needed the extra time were exactly the people who could not leave in a hurry. By the time the order was real, the window was nearly shut. On the morning of Wednesday, September 28th, Ian turns toward the coast of Lee County. The outer bands are already ashore, and the sea is already rising. At around 5 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, the eye of Hurricane Ian makes landfall near Cayo Costa, one of the barrier islands guarding the mouth of Charlotte Harbor. It comes in as a high-end Category 4, with sustained winds of 155 miles an hour, 2 miles an hour below the threshold of a Category 5. A later reanalysis would conclude it had been a Category 5 at the moment it struck. The central pressure at landfall is near 940 millibars. But on this coast, the wind is not the killer. The water is. Ian is a wide, slow storm, and it drags the Gulf of Mexico ashore with it. The surge that had been forecast arrives almost exactly as predicted. At Fort Myers Beach, the water rises 10 to 15 feet above the ground, and in some places higher still. The sea does not creep in. It surges, lifting homes off their foundations, tearing mobile homes apart, carrying cars and boats and pieces of houses inland on a single moving wall. On the barrier islands, whole streets vanish under moving water. In the city of Fort Myers, the surge sets a record for the gauge there. Behind it, the wind strips roofs and snaps the power grid across the region into darkness. And in the low neighborhoods, the people who had not left are now trapped inside water that is still climbing. They move to second floors that many of these houses do not have. They stand on furniture. They climb into attics. Some of them call family members who can do nothing but stay on the line and listen. Nearly 60% of the people who die in Hurricane Ian die the same way, by drowning, in their own homes and cars and streets, in the surge that had been printed in a forecast days before it came. Across Lee County, emergency lines fill with calls that cannot be answered. The surge and the wind have made the roads impassable, and no boat and no truck can move through it while the storm is still overhead. More than 2.5 million homes and businesses across Florida lose power, and on the barrier islands, the darkness is total. For the people trapped in it, there is nothing left to do but climb higher and wait for a morning they are not certain they will see. When the rescues finally begin, by boat and by helicopter in the days that follow, crews pull thousands of survivors from rooftops, from flooded upper floors, from the wreckage of homes that had been shoved clean off their lots. Some they reach in time, many they do not. Among them is a woman named Ilonka Kines, 82 years old, who lived on Fort Myers Beach with her husband. When the storm came, they did not get out. Her husband's body was found first. Ilonka went missing entirely. It would take more than 3 months before a debris crew, clearing the wreckage of the island, found her remains deep in the mangroves where the surge had carried her. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning. She was one of many. The overwhelming majority of the people Ian killed were over the age of 70. Nearly a quarter were in their 70s. Roughly 1 in 5 were in their 80s. These were not people who ignored danger. They were people for whom leaving was the hardest thing to do, and who were given the least time to do it. Others died trying. One man, 87 years old, from Fort Myers, did try to leave. He got as far as the town of LaBelle before turning back toward home through rising water. He was found later in his car, submerged in a drainage culvert. He had done what he was told. He had simply been told too late, on roads that were already filling, in a region that takes many hours to cross, even on a clear day. When the water finally pulls back, it leaves a coastline that is no longer recognizable. The Sanibel Causeway, the only road connecting Sanibel and Captiva to the mainland, has broken apart. Whole sections of it collapsed and washed into the water, cutting the islands off completely. The bridge to Pine Island fails the same way. For days, the only way onto the islands is by boat or by air. On Fort Myers Beach, an estimated 97% of the buildings are damaged or destroyed. Entire blocks are reduced to bare concrete slabs and scattered pilings, the houses that stood on them simply gone. The numbers, when they are finally counted, are staggering. Hurricane Ian kills more than 150 people directly or indirectly, the great majority of them in Florida, and more than 50 in Lee County alone, more than any other county. It is the deadliest hurricane to strike Florida since the Labor Day storm of 1935. The damage reaches roughly $112 billion across the United States, making Ian the costliest hurricane in Florida's history, and the third costliest in the history of the country. And then comes the question that never fully goes away. How many of these people did not have to die? In the months afterward, investigations into the death toll reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Many of the deaths were preventable. The surge that killed most of the victims had been forecast in detail. The residents most likely to die were the elderly and the isolated, exactly the people the county's own plan had promised to move first and earliest. Officials defended the timing. The governor argued that Lee County had acted appropriately once the forecast turned toward it, that the storm had genuinely been aimed farther north for much of its approach. And it is true that the cone did move. But the surrounding counties had read the same forecasts and ordered their people out a day sooner. The plan on the shelf had said 48 hours. The order came in closer to 30. The distinction is the whole story. The storm was an act of nature, enormous and largely unstoppable. Ian would have flooded this coast no matter what any official did. But whether the houses were empty or full when the Gulf came through them was not up to the weather. That was a human decision about a single word and about when to say it. In the years since, Lee County has rebuilt, unevenly, the way these places always do. New homes rise on Fort Myers Beach, higher off the ground than the ones that were lost. The causeway to Sanibel was repaired in weeks, an emergency of engineering that the original evacuation could never match. Flood maps have been redrawn, and the debate over evacuation timing has been folded into every plan for the next storm. Whether any of it is enough is a question that each new hurricane season reopens. Ian did not simply drown southwest Florida. It exposed the space between what everyone knew was coming and the moment anyone was finally told to move. The storm was always going to come. The water was always going to rise. But for so many of the people it took, the difference between living and dying was not the strength of the hurricane. It was one day. Every storm eventually ends, but the way we hold each other, that remains. If you lived through Ian, or through Charlie before it, or if you have ever stood at a window and watched a forecast turn toward your own street, this channel is for you. Take care of one another, stay ready, and I will see you in the next one.